conversation with.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining in today, and welcome to another session of In Conversation with. We are Art and Artisans, and I'm Priyanshi, a visual artist based in India. And today we have Grace Gelder with us. She is a London-based photographer and an educator with a BA in visual art performance and MA in photography. Her work often explores the relationship between photographer and subject and the collaborative potential of photography as a medium. So we welcome you, Grace. And let's dive into the session. Let's just talk a little bit about you and your process.
Okay, thank you for having me, Priyanshi. It's great to be here. I'm, as you said, I'm a photographer and I'm an educator, and I've just started a PhD as well. So I'm doing a practice-based PhD at the moment. I do mostly portrait photography for different clients, and then my own personal projects as well. And I also design and facilitate different types of photography workshops and courses in galleries and museums mostly. But I've also been a guest lecturer at universities, and I've done quite a lot of socially engaged projects, which means using photography to communicate different experiences with community organisations or projects that are looking to work on social justice. So a whole range of ways of bringing cameras into different spaces and helping people to communicate different ideas.
Yes, lovely. So 2020 had been really productive for you because I've been like checking out all the feeds on Instagram and posts, and it's wonderful. And we were lucky to have you at Surat as well in a photography exhibit, so that was kind of cool. So, how was the process like? Because obviously the projects that you have been doing throughout 2020 are quite diverse in a way. So just share us your experience and the process with each project. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, okay. So to start of 2020, I was happily nice and warm and in Surat. And I really enjoyed that residency, which was with Something Useful Project. So there were three sort of aspects to that residency. I would say there's the Belongings Project. There was the intensive that I delivered for Surat School of Fine Arts. And there was a project that I did that was like a sort of an unexpected extra project. And that was called That Splendid Dwelling Place of My Beloved. And my works were exhibited at the Tapi Festival at the end of February, beginning of March 2020. And the work of the students that I was working with will be exhibited TBC in London at some point, because as we know, there's been a pandemic since then. So the Belongings Project was a project that I had developed during a shorter residency in northern Sweden. And I was there for 2 weeks, and I basically invited people in the local community to share an object that was considered to be a family heirloom, which means it was an object that was passed down and it had some significance to it. And what this did was provided a vehicle and a way of inviting people to share a story about their family through the object. So it's quite an intimate project to do. And when I started to do this project in Surat, it involved some incredible meals, I'm not going to lie. Like I had some huge dinners and conversations, and I met some absolutely wonderful people. And so the project itself became a kind of a ritual of sharing of stories. And I think if I was to pick out a key moment from that particular project, it would be that a lot of the younger people who introduced me to their relatives had no idea that these objects were even in their houses. So there was a lot of intergenerational learning taking place, which was a really nice, unexpected consequence. Then that splendid dwelling place of my beloved was basically me noticing that in Surat, near the place I was staying, near the university, there's a lot of lovers were meeting in the dark under trees and hiding behind motorbikes. And I'd never seen anything like that before, and I found it quite fascinating. So with a friend and the mother of a friend, we went and spoke to some of the couples and got permission to photograph them on the grounds that I would keep their identity anonymous. And then my friend Ankita, she embroidered the faces of the people who we'd promised to keep anonymous. So that was kind of like I'm finding this interesting, and spent a couple of evenings going and speaking to people. But then I decided to install that with a motorbike, so that the kind of the classic setup was still there in the gallery. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going off track, but those were the projects that I did in India at the beginning of the year. Then, of course, I left as planned on the 20th of March and went straight into a global pandemic. And as we all know, for artists, last year was like a different and interesting time. And I used the time to do a photography project. I have a lot of different friends who I've also photographed over the years, sometimes for commission, sometimes for fun. And I thought it'd be interesting to put images that were taken in person and next to an image that was taken through Zoom. So that project was a collection of sort of diptychs of pre-COVID portraits and then Zoom portraits. So that was another thing that I worked on over the spring. And then in the summer, the restrictions were relaxed in the UK, and I was able to do some of the work that I do with my friend Niaz Maleknia. We together have a project called Young Photographers London. So we were delivering photography workshops to young people in London, particularly young people who are looked after. So they are in residential care, or they have a foster family. So the PhD scholarship I got was in November, and I'd already planned to go to the south of France for Christmas to see a friend who I hadn't seen for a long time. And I was very lucky because I got to France and then everything went closed behind me. So I ended up staying for 2 months. The husband of the friend, who's also a friend, he works in the hospital in Nice. And Nice has one of the highest rates of COVID in France. And he spoke to his boss, who's the head of the intensive care department, about me coming along and taking some photos of the staff, because I was particularly interested in the healthcare workers and their experiences. And as you know, like, it's such a media story, and everybody's got such an idea about what they think this work is, or what kind of experience these people must be having. But also, I don't know if it's the same in India, but in the first wave, there was a lot of focus and attention on these amazing healthcare workers, calling them heroes, campaigns of clapping and banging saucepans. And then by the third wave, or almost a year on, it's kind of just assumed that they're still just doing what they're doing. But obviously, they've had a very, very exhausting year. So it was quite interesting to sort of sense that exasperation that a lot of the healthcare workers are experiencing, alongside a lot of the stress that they're under. So for me, it was just, if I'm going to be doing research into this topic and giving people cameras and exploring different ways of working through experiences with photography, I kind of want to know what it is they actually do. And that was a really great opportunity to be in a space where people are doing that kind of work, and examine the detail of what care is in a context of COVID. So there were all sorts of like smaller details that you can't possibly know unless you're seeing it. And so that was very interesting. And they were really welcoming and let me just be in the space with them. And they said to me at the very beginning, they said, you'd be very, very welcome, but you'll also be very quickly forgotten because we've got a job to do. So that was really great, because I would move around and just, I would never spend a long period of time there, because I'm aware that, you know, there is a consequence to my presence. So I would spend maybe a couple of hours there each time. And then did a series of photographs, which is going to be made into a book. So I'm currently in the editing phase of that project. I'll happily share a few images with you as well. But there's something about like what the specific kinds of care that COVID requires as well, because as you know, it's a virus that affects people who are often heavier. So the patients in the ward are generally bigger and heavier than like in pre-COVID times. So there's a consequence of that on the staff. You know, that it's more intensive labour. It's the people are heavier, the staff are having to use more muscle, and that's just something I hadn't really thought about until I saw what that looks like. And we sort of have this like socially distanced. Everybody's a little bit separate from each other, but actually if you're working in a hospital, that's not an option. So there's a lot of touching involved, which again I was like, oh, of course, you know. So yes, this is something that I'm still working with at the moment as a project, trying to capture those ideas. But
Yeah, so you know, like Grace, when we click a picture, especially during these times, it's often well curated, or probably a little bit of manipulated. So a picture does tell truth, but it can reveal or it can conceal a truth. So especially in today's time, there's a lot of responsibility, what we are sharing visually when it comes to pictures, especially photographs, because obviously it is an instantaneous capture of a place, or a subject in a way. So there has to be a sense of responsibility. That's what I think. But then also we just like click it randomly, especially for Instagrams and TikToks and those kind of stuff. So do you have like any opinion on that, about photography or a photograph as a responsibility? So something can be used as propaganda. What do you think about it?
yeah, I think it's quite an interesting area, and it's one that I first started to be aware of when I did my MA in 2007, because what you have the legal, and that obviously varies country to country. You have the legal guidelines, rules for photography around copyright, around privacy, these kinds of things. Then you also have what you would consider an ethical practice, and they're not the same thing. So each photographer has to decide what their sort of ethical code of conduct is, if you like. And of course, that is very subjective, and it depends very much on you as a person and how you operate in the world. So you might consider it's absolutely fine to walk down the street if somebody's got the lights on and the curtains open. Of course, I can photograph them in their house doing whatever they want, whatever I want. No, sorry, that didn't come out right. So of course I can photograph them in their home if I want to, whatever they're up to. Another photographer might be like, that's definitely not something that I would like to do, because that person is at home relaxing and doesn't want to be photographed doing their personal business. Now, there are different laws in different countries around that and whether that's legal or not. But for me, this is a really important area, because there's a lot of grey area. So for me, there are things that I won't do as a photographer that I know other people who are photographers that wouldn't think twice about doing. So it's quite a difficult area, but I think you mentioned like the word propaganda.
Yeah.
So there are some things that are very tricky. Like if I put one of my photos onto my stock library and somebody buys that and uses it for a government campaign that's communicating something that I don't agree with politically, there's not really very much I can do about that. So you have all these territories that are quite tricky and complicated, but it's really important that as a photographer you think about what is your stance, what is your political stance, what is your ethical stance, what sort of a photographer do you want to be and why. And I think that, like you're saying, there's a lot of imagery out there at the moment. There's a lot of social media apps that use imagery. We're living in a time where like photos are data that can be used to determine all sorts of things we don't understand yet. So it's actually quite an overwhelming subject. But I think that's in terms of the images that you end up with. In terms of how you operate as a photographer and what you will and won't do, I think that's a very personal process. And I think there's more and more guidance around that is emerging, because that can be something that's when I was learning about that, there was less of a image saturated world going on out there. Whereas now I think that's something that people do need support with, and that I cover that quite a lot when I'm teaching or working with groups. Is it okay to take that photo of that person? And it's something I did notice a lot in Surat, actually, when I was working with the students. There was questions around, it might be around wealth. Can you just photograph somebody that doesn't have much money? Is that image contributing to a wider discussion about social justice, or is it just reiterating something we've seen a lot of times already? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Which brings me to another question. It's about choosing your subjects. How do you choose your subjects?
Mm-hmm.
And if we have a camera, do we have the authority to click anybody's picture we want? So, do we have the authority to choose our subject?
I think, I mean, just because you have a camera, no, it doesn't give you the authority to do what you want, for sure not. So, for example, when I was doing the Belongings project in Surat, it's always an invitation. So I rarely do a project and then go, I want to photograph that person specifically. I would usually have an idea, and then I would want other people who are interested in that idea to come forward and be part of it. So I usually work with like an invitation. If I'm, because I don't work in advertising or fashion where you literally would choose a model for a certain look, that's not the way that I work. But if it's for a project that's exploring a theme or an area or a story, then I would want the people who are part of the project to be actively wanting to be in it. So then it becomes like a call for participation rather than I want you and this is why. Of course, when I was walking up and down the street and seeing all of these like lovers hiding under the trees at night, they were already there. So that it was me approaching and saying, would you be interested in being part of this project? And many of them said no, of course, this is something incredibly sensitive. But the ones who did agree would ask some questions to help them understand what it was, and then with more information would be able to say yes or no, I want to be part of your project. So there's different ways depending on the exact specifications, but that's generally how I work.
It's quite nice that you invite people. It's quite nice to hear that you invite them, and I think it is really important to like even click pictures with consent. Consent is trending.
Yeah, it's trending, yeah, which is good, but it's also quite complicated because with photography, like if I'm doing a photo shoot of somebody, and if we have a good rapport exchange, then it can make you feel quite good if somebody has like captured something about you that you enjoy. So it can make you go into a different energy somehow. So I've had before people who just feel really great in the photo shoot. They look at the photos straight away, they go, oh, I absolutely love this. And then the next day, when they're not quite so hyped up from having a lovely time, they might change their mind. So I think with everything, you know, consent is something that changes moment to moment. And I think, you know, this is part of the wider debate, and it's very important to keep checking in. Which is again where the ethics and the legal stuff clashes, because you may have somebody's signature, yes, I'm happy for you to have my photo. They might change their mind halfway through, and then what do? You already have their signature. As a photographer, what call do you make? You know? So it's, yeah.
So in your process, in your creative process, do you prefer, like, do you always prefer aesthetics, like beauty, or do you prefer like reality, or to like portray how real is it?
This is a big theme there, Priyanshi. But it is a conversation I was having last week, because I started to just question myself. There's a photographer who was criticised quite famously for this called Sebastian Salgado. He photographed workers in a quite unpleasant working conditions, and he made them look very beautiful. So then the debate is, you know, is that ethical to show something that's quite exploitative in a very beautiful way? So this is quite a constantly evolving discussion. And so I was thinking about the photos I'd taken in the intensive care ward, and bear in mind this is Nice, south of France. The light is incredible, and occasionally I would take a photograph that had like a more sort of ethereal quality to it, and it made it look like this space is something quite beautiful. But actually this is a hospital where people are dying, you know. So is that okay to be photographing, and I'm not photographing the identity of any of the patients, by the way, but if I'm photographing something and making it look really glorious, does that distract from the hard work that these people are actually doing? And how is that? And it's not something that I haven't settled on an outcome, or haven't settled on an exact decision about how I'm going to do this project. On one part of me, I'm trying not to overthink it, and the other part, I'm trying not to like overlook things. So there's always that tension when you're doing something sensitive, I think. Yeah, so for me, I generally I probably have a few different visual strategies going on when I'm working. One might be to look for like quite you know, moments where the light is very, very beautiful, and then there might be some other that's a bit more illustrative, trying to communicate what something actually is, or illustrate a point or a narrative. But this is, you know, this changes and moves all the time.
That's fine. That's fine. So again, the selection process is again a difficult task. At least for me, it's really difficult to select which picture is a nice one or appropriate one. So how is it? How do you, because you have printed the book. I mean, Belongings have like all these incredible pictures, and I just cannot believe how did you manage to pull it off like this? Because I mean, I just want to know what were the behind the scenes like.
So I think with Belongings, it was a slightly easier process, because I would know that I needed a good portrait of somebody. So there'd be a portrait that I'm happy with, and then there'd be a photograph of the object that I'm happy with. So there's two quite clear objectives. Of course, that makes it sound a lot easier than it was. Like sometimes I would have loads of pictures to choose from, and it would be very hard. Sometimes I made the call to put a couple of photos for one person and not just one, or, you know, I had a bit of freedom, but it was slightly easier because I kind of knew the final outcome, the structure of it at least. Whereas the project I've been doing now in the hospital, I haven't, I don't have an exact final outcome. I went as a kind of to let things emerge and see what I noticed. And so now I have quite a hard task of editing that, because there's lots of sort of miniature stories within there, and then there's some kind of stylistic similarities, and then there are some that are very different, and it's going to be quite a tricky edit. And for that, I would always speak with people whose opinions I trust and send them a selection and say, you know, how does this sit together? There's people I've met throughout my career who I would go to for that sort of support. Other photographers or other photographers who work in a different way, as well as people from other backgrounds and disciplines. I think that's really important to remember, that it's not just going to be photographers that see your work. So it's nice to get different opinions. But yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, it's not easy. It depends what it is you're editing for, and and how many images you need to condense something down to, as well as how many you photographed, how many photographs you have in the first place.
It is a tedious process indeed. I want to know, like, one moment or an experience that brought you close to photography as a craft, that made you realize that you want to evolve in this craft.
So, okay, the one that just jumped out, I mean, there's many. The one that just jumped out is when I was doing my final MA project, I was in Mongolia, and I was doing a project where I was photographing professional women in their workplaces in the capital of Mongolia, because I had no idea that 66% of the professional workforce in Mongolia were female. So that, first of all, meant I had to change my idea based on what I discovered when I got into certain situations. I was like, oh, wow, this is way more interesting. And I was in the women's prison just outside of Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. And I was photographing the director of the prison. And she was quite an intimidating woman at first meeting. You know, she had like military uniform on, and she was like, why do you want my picture? What's your project about? So we had a conversation via my friend who was translating. And at some point she must have decided, yes, okay, I want to be part of this project. And she disappeared into a little room behind her, and she was gone for a little while. And when she came out, she'd put on her like jacket, her proper like military jacket, her military hat, as well as this bright magenta lipstick. And it was just this moment where it was like, okay, you want to, you know, I'm going to be part of your project. This is how I want to be seen. And then she arranged her desk exactly how she wanted it. And she had a really good time. So I think there was something, that was the moment for me, because I hadn't done a lot of portrait work at that point. I'd just been sort of trying to understand why I was interested in photography and taking photos of everything. And this was shot on film as well. So there was a whole much more slow kind of ritual process to the whole thing. But that was the moment when I realized that this gave people an opportunity to present who they were, and that was quite a responsibility for me. And so just to honor that aspect of what I'm doing, and it made me want to do more work like that.
Wow, that's an interesting story indeed. So, what is the importance of captions and words while it comes with pictures?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, because when you're learning about photography or documentary work, journalistic work, you're told, you know, the caption should not just repeat what is in the image unless it's there for access purposes. So if you are giving your image a caption in a photo story, for example, you would put a caption that adds some information to the image. So that's kind of like one sort of basic approach. And then as you go, you realize there are no hard and fast rules exactly, and you are free to use text however you like. So depending on the work, like for me, for the belongings project, for example, this is a photo of an object, but because the different places I've done it, the objects have different cultural significance or religious significance or ancestral significance. You might go, wow, that is a really beautiful object, but you won't know the story behind it, which is the point of the project, is to draw the stories out. So then the text is really important because it basically tells you the information that is the mystery in the image. So for that sense, it's quite a straightforward need for the text. But equally, some images are quite abstract and more poetic, and then some poetic text can add another layer of poetry to that image. So that's another approach, is to shape the words in the way that you've shaped the light and the form. So there's so many different reasons that you would use text with your imagery, and it is very much depends on the circumstances and the project or what the images are for. Generally, it should add something rather than repeat what's going on with the image, which is something I don't always get right, of course.
So what are your views on between like mobile photography and photography with the camera? So do you think it does make different, apart from printing process, do you think it does make any difference, like whether it's a mobile photography or a camera, a professional camera?
So I think, again, that's like, it very much depends, but there's a very interesting book that just came out, I think last year, called The Social Photo. And I found that very interesting because it talks about how we apply like fine art logic to mobile phone photography with regards to social media, and that's not very helpful. So if we're starting to be like, oh, there's just so many images everywhere, it's not art anymore. Like, this is the kind of default, it's a perspective that we hear a lot. And I find that quite interesting because what this book says is that actually we shouldn't be looking at social media and mobile phone photography with that framework. What it's actually able to do is to give us a really interesting comment on society. So it's like social commentary, and we have to view that as a different kind of data and not like an art object, because actually then we're missing a lot of really interesting things you can notice from smartphone photography and the way that we share images. That tells us a lot about us as humans, which is really interesting information. So in terms of like a kind of social phenomenon, I think it's really, really interesting. But again, if I'm doing a photo for a client, it depends what it's for again. Sometimes people need like a really high resolution image, and sometimes they are like, this is for web purposes. But generally speaking, if you've got a very good digital SLR, you're going to be using that for work / personal projects. And I use my phone a lot for just going around putting stuff on my Instagram story. That's more about communicating with my friends and family. So there's become different roles, but that's how I use it. I think you need to know what is it that you're doing and what's the best medium for that. And if it's like creating memories or saving memories or having visual conversations with somebody, then that's a different objective than taking an image that's going to get blown up to A0 to go in a gallery. So
yeah, so that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you so much, Grace, for doing this for us.
Thank you. It's lovely to chat to you, Priyanshi, as usual.
Same here. Bye-bye.